We'll start the CSS. We'll try to get the basics done first, and then we can work on different examples. Right. So, like what we learn in Java, so the HTML, right? So we understood that it's a very lightweighted language. We don't have much things to be learned in that language, right? So likewise in CSS also it is a very lightweighted language because it's also focusing only one aspect, right? So in HTML we understood we only focusing on how we place the content properly in the web page. That is what the whole plan by using the HTML, right? So based on their content behavior, we use the proper HTML tag. So if it is a heading, we use the heading tags. If it is a paragraph, we use the paragraph. If it is a hyperlink, we use the anchor tag, right? If it is a table that you are going to showcase, so then we use the tables and the list and the forms and input fields. So those are the proper elements that we should use to present the content. So therefore, it will be focusing only on the content placement, right? So there's nothing much to be learned in there. Likewise, in the CSS, the whole purpose of using it to style the HTML content, right? Whatever that you place using the HTML, you can modify their styling, right? So it may be the colors, it may be the sizes, or different shapes, right? Or the alignments, right? So those things we can change by using the CSS. So the history part of this is like before coming into the CSS, we had the Java HTML language. So the HTML language is totally focusing on the content as well as designing. Both aspects are recognized in the HTML because we don't have the CSS at that time. So in that case, there was a big issue that when you are developing a website, that means where you have multiple web pages, the maintaining of the HTML content and the styling will be very difficult, right? We may have to write styles multiple times. Same style we need to repeat because there's no way that we can keep the style in a one location and access applied into the multiple HTML contents, HTML elements. So it's not possible in that time. So therefore, the code is repeating so many times, and then it will be a huge effort that we are going to modify this, right? Because the code is repeating in so many places. So then we have to find each and every place and then change it. So that's basically a time spending, and then your effort is very high, and then there's a risk that can be happen. Like lot of issues can be happen because we keep the style and the content in the same HTML page. There may be mistakes can be happen, right? So because of that, scientists decided without using the HTML for the both purposes, right? What are the both purposes? Content placement and the styling, right? Without use it for the both purposes, we will develop another language which will only serving the stylings, and the HTML will keep it for the content placement, right? So that is the understanding at that time. Because of the issues that comes by keeping the HTML as the source for content placement and the styling, so they decided to make it split into another language. So that is why the cascading style sheet or the CSS is introduced into the web, right? I hope everyone clear about that. So remember that the CSS is somewhat introduced in 1992, 1993, around that, and the HTML was at the beginning of the 90s, right? So after a couple of years later, the CSS is introduced into the world. We need to understand that the CSS is used to style the HTML. No, that's a direct link is there. That means like without the HTML, there's no use of CSS. No, so if you don't have the HTML, then you don't need to use the CSS, right? Because if you have the HTML, then only the CSS can style it. No, so remember that as well. So because of that, there are options that they developed how to use the CSS into the HTML, how to apply the CSS into the HTML. That is the first thing that we are going to look at. What are the ways that the CSS can communicate with the HTML, right? So that is the first thing that we need to learn, right? So the presentation it's basically tells you why we use the CSS and some points as well, right? So what is CSS? It's a set of rules, right? So again, I'm telling these are instructions, no? So when you type something, that's the language can consider it as an instruction provided by the developer. So a set of rules for displaying the markup content. So we know the markup content that we are using is HTML, right? So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So the CSS is a set of rules that will use to display markup content, right? And then this word use CSS has cascading, right? So the cascading means that the rules are applied in order, right? So that means there's a proper order is there for the code, right? So this order is at the beginning, you can understand it's like a top to bottom order. What you write on the top and what you wrote on the below of the same page. The last code that executed by the browser will be the bottom code, right? Because the browser is going to read the code from top to bottom. Even in the HTML, that is same, no? The browser is reading the HTML code from top to bottom, right? So therefore, what you wrote at the bottom will have the higher priority, or it has the higher priority of applying it onto the HTML. Whereas the top content, top CSS will have a lower priority, right? So we'll see that within an example. So that behavior tells it's a cascading behavior, right? So it's applied in order, top to bottom order, right? And also it provides an option to create a new style file, right? So we know so far we learned two files, right? So one is the HTML file, and with the today lesson, you notice that there's another file type called .php, right? So those are the two files types that you learn. With the CSS, we can create another file. The file extension is .css, right? So the .css file is used to write purely CSS commands, right? By doing that, you will understand later on this is the good approach where we can keep the styles in a one page and use it in multiple HTML files. So one place we write the code which is apply for multiple HTML files. So that has a very huge benefit because we know that our styling code is available in a single location. We don't need to go here and there and find out the places where the styles are applied. We can simply go to the place where we wrote the code and modify it. It will be applied in all the files where the that file is linked, right? So that is the other thing where you can have a separate CSS file. So why we use this CSS, the benefits, right? So those are the benefits that we can find out. One is the efficiency, right? So efficiency will be very high when you are not repeating the code, right? So then it's easily execute, no need to be repeat multiple times, and more option for displaying content. So that's also like comes with the having a separate language. So CSS is a separate language, therefore they have introduced so many options to style the HTML page, right? Compared to the attributes, there are so many uh, options available to style the HTML content, right? And then the huge benefit is that you can separate the content from the display. You can keep the display part done by the HTML and the content part uh, handled by the HTML, and the displaying part can handle from the CSS, right? So this will be basically fixing the HTML issues, the styling issues, where you repeat the code multiple times to do the styling. So if you look at the versions of the HTML, so somewhere in 1996, not 1993, they introduced the first level of CSS, or the first version, CSS1, and the 1998, after 2 years, they introduced the CSS version 2, and then like it goes for a longer period, and then they go with the revision, right? So that revision version is considered as 2.1, or the 2 revision 1, right? So that revision was a huge change for the language, right? Which was positively affected to the CSS language. They have found out and fixes a lot of issues in the previous version, and then they fix and they introduce new stuff. But still, like when they are introducing, they said that it's just a revision of the level 2. But if you compare with the actual version 2 and the 2.1, they have done a huge change into the language. So because of that, it's not a good idea to say it's a subversion or revision version of the CSS2, right? Rather than that, we can tell it as a new version of CSS. So therefore, they like industry and most of the scientists, they try to engage saying that it's a new version of CSS, which is called CSS version 3 or the level 3, right? But the actual story behind is they introduce it as the 2.1. But nowadays we are using this revision version, right? And then we don't say anymore it's a 2.1, we say it's the version 3, or else we say it's the level 3. So the CSS version 4 still under draft mode. They haven't completed 100% yet, but probably they will come up with that. The only uh, time consumes reason is that in between this version, like after the version 3, even in the HTML also they introduce a new version, that is HTML5 version, right? Somewhere like this will be, if I am not mistaken, somewhere like 8 years or 5 years before they introduced the HTML5 version, right? So to make it compatible with the new changes done in the HTML5 version, so CSS need to be wait until the browsers were fully compatible with these changes. So as per my understanding, they may come up with a new version very soon. So we need to see what are the changes that comes with the HTML4 version. But so far we will be using the CSS3. Then I'll explain a scenario that how the syntax looks like, right? So most of the time our code will be looks like when you are writing the CSS code, right? So you can see here, they are somewhat called a selector. and then open the curly brace and close the curly brace. And inside this open and close curly brace, we write the property and the value. Right. So you will understand this when I'm writing the code. So the selector part, what it does, it will have the command to execute what's the HTML element that you are going to select. Right, because anyway, like finally what should happen is what you wrote under CSS, that should be applied onto HTML. No, so that means the CSS should know to what HTML element this style should apply. So therefore, under this location, we place what's the HTML tag we are going to select to apply these properties. So the properties are already mentioned under the open and close curly brace. So that gives us the opportunity to have another selector and open and close the bracket and then type another set of properties. So these three properties will apply for this selector, and what I wrote here will be applied for this selector. So that means I can keep a multiple properties applied into different HTML element there, right? So that is how like it works. So to make it the properties are owned by one particular selector, we use this curly brace, right? So that will be a what I can say kind of a boundary line, right? So we are providing a boundary line for the properties to get applied, right? So outside that boundary, whatever that you wrote will not going to be applicable, right? So that may applicable for a different selector, but within this, these properties are applicable for this selector. So this selector means it finally selecting HTML code, right? So keep that in mind, these curly braces and the property how we write. First you need to mention what's the property name and put the colon, right? And then after that put the value. So if you revise your HTML knowledge, we were doing similar like this, no? Even in here. So here we say this is the attribute name and this is the attribute value. So the value is assigned using the equal symbol to the attribute name. But in CSS, we don't use the equal sign. Instead of that, we use the colon. It's not semicolon, that is colon. Right? So that is how the structure of the CSS. So now we'll move to write one simple code, right? So that is something we already knows. In the HTML we did this. So under CSS I will create a new file called inline css.html. So this inline CSS is something that pretty much similar to the attribute what you use, right? So I'll just put the HTML, and here if I use the h1 tag, and then we'll say this is title of the page, and then under here we can put the attribute. So similar to that, we can write the CSS using a style attribute in HTML. So when you put the style attribute, the value part is what the CSS, right? So in CSS, I already show you how the properties and the values are written. So you need to have the property name, colon, and the value. So if I just try to change the color of this text, I can simply use the CSS property called color and then colon, right? After that, I can tell whatever the color I want. I'll go with the value called blue velvet. And then finally, I will put the semicolon. So the semicolon will tell us that this is the end of the line. Right? So I'll save this file and go to the page. Here I'll go inside the CSS file and click on the inline. So you can see now the text was turned into the blue velvet color. This is again pretty much similar to the attribute scenario, right? I told you that attribute is not going to be work. So here we have the HTML as well as CSS, right? Which is the same scenario that we observe in the HTML and the attributes. So this is not a good practice, right? But this option is there if we required to apply, right? So that doesn't say that every time you should apply. So if required, you can use it, right? So this is what we call adding CSS inline, right? And if I use another heading, right? So we'll say this is the H2. We say this is a subheading. And this time what I do is I'm writing the code not on the HTML line code line. I will put it the CSS in separately, right? What I do is the code I'll going to place it under the head tag, right? Within the head tag. Then I want to use this select option, no, because I know that now what I wrote here is not have any link between these HTMLs in the body. So that means I have to have a selection mechanism. So before that, first thing is I need to mark my boundary where I'm going to say that within this style tag, what I wrote is considered as the CSS, right? So I will first write the selector so that there are multiple selection times available. So I'm using a very common selector that is called the tag selector. So the tag that I want to select with that name I will use. So the tag what I want to select is H2. I will type H2, that's the selector, and open and close the curly brace. Now you can see here I am following this structure. So for the selector I will put the tag name and open and close the curly brace. That is what you already observed. And here within the curly brace I will type the font color, right? So again the same property and value will be appears, right? So for this I will use the brown color and put the semicolon. So now this says use this property to the selector which was mentioning here. So I have mentioned the selector is H2, so that will be applied this brown color to this H2 tag. So if I refresh the page, now I should be able to see that the brown color is applied into my second heading. Okay, so this is what we call a CSS which is embedded onto the HTML page. So I'm going to write the comment here under the CSS. So in the CSS we use the /**. Under that we can write our comment. So I would say that this is adding CSS into the HTML page. All right. Or else we can say this is CSS embedding file extension has to be a CSS file extension, right? So we can have a CSS code written in here. So if you can look at the previous work what we did here, we changed the H2 font color by using this tag selection, right? So we basically look at the tag name and from our CSS code we attach to that tag name, and we are providing some colors to the font. So likewise we'll say we have paragraph now, right? And the paragraph having some dummy contents, right? So from the CSS file, what I do is I'll select the paragraph like this with the tag name, and then I will give, we'll say, a background color. So that is background dash color. We'll say that I'll give this blue color. Right. So I have given this blue color, and then so this is the place where we tell for the HTML that there's a external file available. So right now we have the file in the same location. So this is wrong then, no? So the path is wrong. So this has to be on the same location. So therefore we can simply tell the file name. Now if I go back to my folder, right? So we were now working on the SAMP server. So therefore make sure that you start the SAMP. From there, I need to go to DAW folder and then the DIWE 109 in the CSS folder. So there we have these two files. You can see these two files, and then if I go on to the inline, now I can see that the paragraph has a background color. So I can apply a font color as well. So after the background color, I will add the color property and then set it to white. So now we can see that the text got white color and the background is blue color. First thing is you should have an external file created like this with any name, but the extension should be .css. That is the important thing. And then from your HTML file, you need to create a link. Right. So once you do that, now your browser knows when it's read this code that there's a file which is a CSS file which need to be read, and then based on that styles it will be basically look at the HTML code and modify it. So in our external CSS file, what we did was we attached to the all paragraphs in the page and then change the background color and the font color. That's what we did.